Okay, so I'm spending the day with a friend in northern New Jersey and southern New York, and what is behind me, it's not super easy to see, is the Hudson River. And I was heading up. We're going to be going up to the Columbia University campus, this Lamont Doherty campus of climate science, and that's maybe about 15-20 minutes further up the road. But as I was going up Palisades Parkway, I saw that there was a pull-off of the Palisades, which are these big basalt cliffs overlooking Manhattan, of the Rockefeller pullout, scenic byway. So I was like, well, I definitely have to check that out. I can't bypass the Rockefeller scenic byway. So, you know, just to provide some context for today, we're trying to connect, I guess, just further building on our relationality of humans to the earth, and the mechanistic outlook versus an animistic outlook, and how that all happens. And so one of the places that we're going to go is a rock feature that is sacred to the original people of this region. But then I guess we're starting out on a rock because we're actually on these basalt cliffs. So I'm sitting on this big piece of basalt. And it's interesting, I made a little heart there, and when I pulled over, I saw that there were these two plaques, one to Lawrence Rockefeller and one to John D. Rockefeller, because essentially they helped to establish this as sort of, I don't know if it's a national park or a state park. It's a protected lands along the Hudson of this Palisades Parkway. And it was originally, I think, envisioned in the late 1920s, but it took until the 1950s for this highway road to be built. And there were big estates here. People that lived in the city and had a lot of money, they would come out here on the weekends, or their families would live out here in the summers. And I think Teddy Roosevelt lived out here, and maybe even there was something about Mark Twain too. So that was kind of interesting. And but when it was made a park, my friend was mentioning in doing some research about the process of that there were still indigenous people that were living in this area, because it was still pretty remote. It's hard to get to. These basalt cliffs are like 300 feet high. And once it was made, quote unquote, public land, then all of those people were pushed out and said that you no longer belong here. You don't have a spot in this space. So there is a sort of a fraught relationship between our idea of public lands and the commons, and what it actually means, because of the original people of Turtle Island who were here before having imposed commons in the Enlightenment way of thinking was even a thing. And so that there's still sort of harm caused to that. And, just thinking about these basalt cliffs. So basalt is a kind of magma that cools. And so we're sitting on these vast pieces of, like, the Earth's core bubbling up, these ancient stones. And my friend had sent me a section, a reading sort of talking about the animus nature of stones. And it goes back a little bit to what I was reading in Louise Erdrich's book about the books and islands, about the stones picking you. Like when you go and you see a rock and you're captivated, like the stone wanted to come with you and go to the next place, right? That there's another kind of consciousness that exists in the stone world, right? There are relatives as well. And if you understand like the matter, and at an atomistic level, like we all have consciousnesses, it's just they present differently. And that through magnetism, which is a huge part of what we're looking at with signals intelligence, the magnetism also records information, records story, in different ways and in different time scales than we can even imagine. Like when I went out to Salt Lake City, and one of the site visits I made was to the computer science lab there, which was essentially a black glass box from the 70s. And in that building, and it was sitting on top of like a research nuclear reactor too. It was where the first virtual item was put into the internet, the Utah Teapot. And it was at the base of the Wasatch Range of mountains, like ancient giant mountains. And sometimes I think we get all worked up about time, not having enough time, or that something is imminently going to happen that is scary and problematic. And I think that the rock relatives help us like if we're paying attention, sort of resituate ourselves in time, because their version of time is at such a different level than the human version of time. Just as our version of time, the human level, is so much different than like a gnat, in terms of the life cycle. And just thinking about the stories that the stones hold over these times, the information it carries, and then how it decays and turns into littler stones and turns into sand and goes into the ocean and fulfills this biosphere, and that we are embedded in our earth and it is embedded in us, and we are all sort of resonating together in some of these stories. So I guess the other thing I wanted to mention, I had done some work in the past around the Dutch and the Swedes, because that early settlement history of Pennsylvania relates very much to Dutch settlement and Swedish settlement, and that those same dynamics go for all of the Mid-Atlantic, including New York. And so one of the wayside over there, it was mentioning the explorations of the Dutch with the ship the Half Moon, which is sort of esoteric. And I guess Henry Hudson was the captain of that ship. I need to revisit the Henry Hudson story. I didn't realize that it was a Dutch ship that he was on, but I think it actually went all the way. They were looking for the crossing and they didn't find it, but they got up as far as Albany. And, knowing all of the stuff that's happening in upstate New York and Albany with photonics and optics and sort of emerging technology, defense computing, with the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and the University of Rochester, and the energetics of that space. I think it's really important to situate these things within the context, and the context of potentially the Dutch East India Company, an empire, and imagining what a photonic empire might look like, the photonic empire of bits versus atoms, and the way in which our relationship to the natural world relates to pushing us into that new photonic empire. Because the campus that we're going to go to next is, it's all about the climate science, right? It's all about managing the Earth as a machine in crisis, essentially. And the narrative arc that's going to be spun out of all the data that they're collecting there is going to be, the end game of that is to push us into the photonic empire, to say we don't really have legitimacy in the real material world of atoms anymore, and that we need to go there in order to save the world and to preserve it. So I think that's mostly what I wanted to say here. Oh, I forgot to say, so Averell Harriman was the governor at the time that this was set up, and I do believe that his mother was actually the funder of the Cold Spring Harbor Labs and the Eugenics Records Office. And so as we think about optimization and entitlement and rights and privileges, and who has access and who doesn't, that resituating ourselves in terms of removal of the original peoples off of these places, the Palisades, which I think it's Latin for stake, because the Palisades were used like giant tree stakes that were made into a fortification. And the early forts were these palisaded forts of trees, but that the original people here imagined that these stone columns were more like stone tree relatives, and so that their view of this space of this the lands were more in terms of a relationality as a relative than as a fortification. So I think the difference in mindset there is pretty important. And eugenics, it's going to come down to technical social progressivism, and in that's where I think largely, the liberal class has to get it together, has to come to a reckoning with its positionality within the machine age. And they often speak to social justice and decolonization, but what's going to be coming with the impact finance space is going to be all about techno optimization and the ultimate dispossession of all of the natural world, using the same dynamics that we dispossessed the original people off of Turtle Island into the metaverse. And so I think it's really important that we sit with that. Like, if we consider ourselves people who are acting for justice among people, justice for the environment, justice for our animal and plant and stone relatives, what that means, and what it means to try to be an expert in that. And I will just say, I'm sitting here under this oak tree. The leaves are just starting to turn, which is quite beautiful. They're not fully turned. There is some Virginia creeper turning red, and there's a little nuthatch on this oak tree over there. So I'm going to pause and turn around and just give you a view, walk around, and then show you the heart that I've made. All right, so we're up on the Palisades. Again, I think these are like 300 feet tall, these big basalt columns. You can see, I think Yonkers is over there. And then this, actually, I forgot to mention, you can see this little creek that's Spuyten Creek, spout of the devil, which is an interesting word there. And that is the body of water that separates the island that is Manhattan from the rest. That's what makes Manhattan an island, is Spuyten. And so these are the view. It's a beautiful view. You can see the skyscrapers off in the distance. And I think if we imagine the domination culture, right? But we were talking a little bit about ley lines. My friend was mentioning that both Manhattan and Philadelphia were on the 40th parallel, like these energetic things. And I think there is something to magnetism and energy that is conveyed, and the stone is very much about that. You can see in the distance. I'm going to walk down and so you can see the natural cliff. You've got some viewpoints. There's a bit over here at the end where you can see the actual rocks themselves. Since we're up on top, it's hard to. I want to make sure that you get a sense of it. So this is all now quote unquote protected, for public use, but again, that protection also came with a certain measure of dispossession. But you can see there the stone face and just the stone beings in their own sense of time, right? My friend Cliff was telling me the other day I was feeling a little stressed and frustrated, and he's like, just try on for the day, like that there's, the time isn't, you don't have to be limited by time. Don't be worried about the time stuff. You can let that go. And I think that's some of the lessons that the rocks teach us is about time. Okay, all right, so we're here. You can see this big piece of basalt, and when I got here and I was like, okay, I have to pay the Rockefellers a visit. So this is the Rockefeller Lookout, and I'll read it. It says, Rockefeller Lookout, named for John D. Rockefeller Jr. in recognition of his public-spirited desire to preserve the Palisades in their natural beauty. And of course, that's the idea of nature, that indigenous people didn't manage nature, but they did. So yes, so that was 1953. And then this one was to Lawrence Spelman Rockefeller, again, for devoted service, the head of the Palisades Interstate Park Commission, 1930 to 1979. And I would say it's important to remember that Lawrence Rockefeller was a major force in the environmental movement. He was an associate of Maurice Strong, who was very central to the UN environmental program, and also Barbara Ward Jackson. So the control of the natural resources is really important. And again, not that we necessarily want to misuse natural resources, but those in power really do want to maintain control of it. And so this is the heart that I made. I have my sweet grass braid that I brought along, and someone really lovely from Canada actually made a beautiful banner a while back with a number of hand stenciled prints, and this is actually the dandelion one, and they each one had a different symbol. And so I decided to it was beautiful altogether, but I was going to leave as tokens some of the flags in different places. So this one I have, this is showing the dandelion. There's a piece of wood, decaying wood that I had that is in the center here, and then a piece of the basalt that's loose. I have mugwort there for good dreams, and then there's a fungus, which is beautiful. I mean, just look at the ripples. Like, talk about communication, right? Like, that is these communication networks. And goldenrod, I brought in a bit of fosterite, which is also related This is from the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona, which is a site of peridot, one of the largest peridot deposits. And then there's some wild rice that my friend from Minnesota gave me in a shell. And next to it is a bit of a leaf of Nicotiana from Bartram's garden. And of course I laid it, I didn't have any dandelion flowers, but dandelion leaves. And this morning I gathered a bunch of Thai basil flowers. It's the tail end of the season. We probably have a few more weeks left before it freezes, but these beautiful purple flowers, you know, I love purple. I really do love purple. So, and they have such a nice scent, cleansing scent. And I had a little candle lit, but it blew out, and some hickory nuts. It's sort of a mast year at this spot anyway for hickory nuts, a lot of hickory nuts, and milkweed. So this is from a beautiful milkweed pod that I had. So hopefully some of those will blow around and we'll get some nice butterfly habitat. And there's the Virginia creeper, which is always such a lovely red. I have a very fond memory of I spent a semester in Venice when I was in college, and there was a beautiful patio in the house that we stayed in, and it was all covered in Virginia creeper, and we were there in the fall, and whenever I see Virginia creeper, I think about that. So yeah, so we're leaving a heart. We're leaving a heart. Hey, universe, the Rockefellers need a little of attention, right? Like, we need to reset ourselves. We need to reset ourselves a bit, and reset our understanding of the environment and what it means to be a good relative across time and space, and to be, like, you look at the lichen, right? What the lichen tells you about the stone. They have these relationships, right? And that they have their ways of breaking the stone down, conveying the information, telling the stories in other ways that we can only just barely imagine. But, you know, we need to think about how to be creative and respectful in our relationship to the environment, and look at things both at the tiny levels and sort of these bigger vistas. Take time to smell the roses, because there's a lot of stories out there. Okay, so before we hop in the car and go down to the Columbia campus, there was a poem. Oh, wow. Well, this wasn't the one I was going to read, but it has the bookmark. And guess what? It's called Carry the Stone. Wow. Okay, universe. Carry the stone it is, right? Like, oh my goodness sakes. Yeah. Oh, and this was a little tiny bit of the stone that broke off this basalt. So carry the stone. All right. So let us see what John says. This is John Trudell, lines from A Mined Mind. And again, with the stone relatives, because the mining, like, a lot of what we're not thinking about is the fact that the telecommunication systems up to this point was built on mining. I mean, it still is built on mining, these technologies, the energy storage, the data storage, the transmission. The last iteration of this was built on copper, and so there was so much devastation connected to environmental harm with the mining of the stones and the disrespect of the stone. So, okay. So carry the stone. Hidden in the beauties of Babylon, a civilized behavioral notoriety. The more evil the empire, the more paranoid the society. So I guess this is kind of perfect for Rockefeller. I'm going to just read that again. Hidden in the beauties of Babylon, a civilized behavioral notoriety. The more evil the empire, the more paranoid the society. Building to the New World Order. Oh, John, we are expected to carry the stone. Emperors and the feeding class, human being used up fast. The miners keep on mining. Intelligence is the mother lode. Imagination as an energy source in this predator's way of dining. Whoa, I'm kind of blown away here. That's amazing. The miners keep on mining. Intelligence, and you think about that, like signals intelligence, open source intelligence, and imagination. Intelligence is the mother lode. Imagination as an energy source in this predator's way of dining. Defining how and what we think as we're led to the way to believe. Conditioned reaction we call thought. Our reality rides in how we perceive. In the ways of being lost and alone, who runs from their doubt and fear, in the mask of everything's normal, who's not feeling or seeing too clear. Could be we're being programmed in a way our spirit bleeds all over our lives become fuel for predator needs. Building the new world order, we're expected to carry the stone. Emperors and the feeding class, human being being used up fast. Hidden in the beauties of Babylon, a civilized behavioral notoriety. The more evil the empire, the more paranoid the society. Wow, that's pretty amazing. Yeah, so mining the imagination, mining the souls, telling us, you know, we're alone because we can't see clearly what it is that we're actually in. But I do think that we can change that. So to start off the day, I'll just do a little So it feels good to be on these old stones, and they're strong and durable, and they've been here a long time, and they have a lot of stories. So let's go see what's going on at Columbia University's Earth Science campus next. Okay, so we're about 15 minutes or so up the road, and it's kind of a bummer because I didn't realize that this was a gated complex. We couldn't go to Tuxedo Park, the Loomis Labs, Alfred Loomis Labs, because Tuxedo Park has a 24/7 gatehouse. And so I thought, well, we'll go to the Columbia University campus, this Lamont campus, which is the earth science area, earth and climate science. And it was the home of, it was an estate, several hundred acres, donated by the wife of Tom Lamont. And Tom Lamont was a Harvard grad who eventually rose to become the board chair of JP Morgan, and I think he replaced, anyway, he was board chair for a while. He was part of the whole Jekyll Island crowd, and when he died, his wife, who was got a master's in philosophy from Columbia, she donated this summer home estate to the university, and they promptly turned it into an earth science and climate science research facility. So but you can't go in, right? Like so many of these things, right? It's science, but for whom and for what purpose? So we're not able to get in today, but I think you get the gist of sort of what's going on. And there's this park, you know, a road here that's a trail through the woods, but there's no parking either, so you can't park here either. So we're a bit of a loss of exploring the campus or the vicinity because of access. So essentially we decided just to stop here, and we made a heart, and I didn't have a lot of outlining material, so my friend had harvested these beautiful dandelion greens from a local farm, and so this one is a little bit more of a loose heart shaped, but we've got the dandelions and I believe borage and chestnuts and some little shells from the Schuylkill where I'm at, and we've got the marigolds for ancestor worship, and some chestnuts with dried dandelions, like a little evocative there of some sort of dandelion intervention on prickly items, and a feather, and then a larger shell, sort of spiral shell with some pokeweed. So this is our offering to the lame Lamont campus of Columbia University that won't let us in. But just to clarify that this is about sort of the earth science, and I've been very interested in sort of the biogeochemistry with the Vernadsky situation. And so these folks, you know, it's interesting, we were talking a little bit about relationality to the earth and an animist version versus a mechanical version. Right, so the animist version of the conception of the universe and our relationship as people to the environment, and the enlightened science animistic, or not animistic version, right? The engineered, the techne version. And so in the techne version and the engineered version, it all gets mixed up with the hedge funds, right? And that's some of what I've been trying to talk about a bit with JP Morgan and the blockchain crypto symposium, and the ways in which these derivatives products in financialized life are, incorporated, but they need the science, they need the data. Everything is about data. And so before we came out today, I was doing a little bit of research on this climate science center, and they have things like all sorts of core samples, libraries and libraries of core samples, tree ring samples. Everything is sort of sampled in these giant vast libraries in these pull-out sections. And if you imagine life, right, as some dynamic process, well, they've just gone and sampled it. But pretty soon the samples aren't even really going to be about having the actual item. They're just going to sample the molecular construct and the relationships of the molecules to one another, and build a digital representation. And so these libraries of information will simply be digital. They will simply exist as bits and not atoms, so they won't even have the core sample. So as disconnected as these libraries of artifacts that represent environments are to the scientists, it's going to be even crazier when we get to the point of everything being in immersive reality and part of synthetic biological design, that they're going to just store it away as information, as data that has no connection to the larger cosmos or the larger universe, or where we fit in it. Like, how do we fit into a simulation? That's why they need us to be avatars, so that we can fit into their simulation and do the simulation modeling that is what climate science is, right? It's all simulation modeling. It's the stories that they're telling with the data that they have. And so I think it's important to think about it that way. So I have this trash can behind me because it's got a volcano on it, Leo, and a coral reef. And so these are both topics that we, Leo, Jason, and I discussed pretty extensively in the parametric insurance video. And I'm sure that they had some school kids or someone come in to sort of decorate these trash cans and make them attractive, and I'm not sure. I guess there are maybe some hikers that would use this trash can, but it's there's some irony in the fact that they've got this, volcanic coral reef trash can in the parking lot, since that's going to be some of these parametric insurance, impact finance derivatives products. And, I often say, even as like with respect to Penn and these universities, that almost all of the departments are doing the work of the alumni of the business schools, right? And so they set the world up so that the business schools can make money off of it. And now maybe in the new version, the data scientists can extract data from it. But I think that's where we're going with the world is, everybody is running the world so that the businessmen and the data analysts can get rich and exert their power and control. But as I said in my last blog post, I think if we can see the labyrinth, we can step out of it. So, universe, this heart is to draw some attention to the fact that just up the road from the Rockefeller Pullout, in the center of this area along the Palisades, along the Hudson, where histories of sort of empire, whether that be the Dutch East India Company or the railroad companies or now the metaverse companies, are trying to exert their control, that ultimately it's the volcanoes that have the last say, right? So life is far beyond what we think that we can control. And, I'm not trying to slam people who are science. I'm not saying that there's no room at all for science, but I would say I don't think that the public has been brought along with how far along the science is or what the intentions are. I think it's very disconnected from ethics and from having a broader understanding of implications of our impact on the world, where oftentimes we're disregarding the harm that science has caused. We're often just talking about the progress, and we're not contemplating intentional and unintentional harms of scientific so-called progress. And the fact that if we choose to inhabit a story that's run by science and data analysts, there really isn't room for the imagination or the intellect or the creativity. And that's what John Trudell was speaking about in that last poem, was this predator class is mining us for that. they're confining our intellect and our imagination into their crystalline blockchain structure, right? But like I said, like ultimately, I think the volcano is going to have the last say. So there are forces out there that are much larger than us, and yeah. So let's keep communicating with the universe, and let's keep drawing attention. Not that we all want it to end in some sort of volcanic destruction, but biogeochemistry is pretty cool too, and just how natural life emerges and evolves. And I think it's probably ultimately going to be a match from whatever they can cook up in their CAD design engineering laboratories. Yeah, so I just wanted to close with one last view of the heart. And actually I brought some of the cattail fluff. So I know it kind of goes everywhere. So I'm gonna sort of sprinkle some of that on here too. Do you mind? Maybe maybe it'll get to some water. I think I can't remember if this is fluff from Shrinemont or Vanguard, but either way, it's kind of cool. From the Anglicans takeover of the indigenous springs to the portfolio mutual funds managing our goodness according to ESG finance metrics. Either one of those. All right, thanks. All right. So there you go, Columbia, home of technocracy and the Manhattan Project. Yeah, know the history, know where it came from, and then just realize that, this science isn't all equal opportunity. They don't really want us to know what they're doing as much as they want us to trust them. We don't know what they're doing beyond those gates, and these scientific closed compounds are built on high finance and power, on JP Morgan fortune, on Jekyll Island, and people are tapped to be the experts for a reason, and they operate behind closed doors. Okay, so this is our last visit for today. We're at the intersection of Airmont and Spook Rock Road in the vicinity of Suffern and Airmont, New York, just over the border with New Jersey. And we're here actually to sort of pay a visit to this stone. It's sort of a collection of stones, which my friend brought my attention to. I think this stone what do you call it? Well, anyway, escarpment was considered sacred to the Lenape people, and it was a gathering point for ceremony. And in 1931, this little corner of land at the corner of this road was donated by a gentleman, David Carlo, for sort of public preservation of this sacred rock area. And so we're here in the spirit of, reconsidering our relationship to the environment and the biosphere and the animus aspect of stone and ritual. And so we put in a nice little installation here. I don't want to be in the shaded out. So some of these are from a local farm. The little yellow leaves are just from here on the trees because the fall color is coming in, and I have some little pebbles holding them down from the garden. And then this, I believe, this larger stone, this little sidebar is from the site here, carrying the stone, as John Trudell would say. And we've got the horse chestnuts and a lot of beautiful calendula and marigolds for sort of honoring the ancestors and those who have gone before us in time and are still sort of with us. And some beautiful, I think maybe mint. I think those might be mint flowers and leaves. And dandelion, and we've got the nice fractal pine cones and a feather to carry our intentions up. So I'll just walk around a bit this is situated on the edge of a property that's actually the local Shabbat Jewish cultural school, which is Interesting. As we're here, we're hearing school bells go off, and we're like, is that an alarm? But I think it actually is just a school bell. And so this is these two properties here, and it's sort of on the edge. And I would say it's to me it's interesting just in terms of the way in which Shrinemont, that was part of the Archdiocese of Virginia, sort of overseeing these sacred places, that this parcel of the rock has been carved out of the area that's now this Chabad Cultural Center. And I'm not sure if people probably don't necessarily remember this, but I'd been doing a lot of work with the Foundation for Integrated Education and their idea of, I think creating a collective learning environment that would be integrated and advance the noosphere, sort of hive mind consciousness concept. And Julius Stulman, he was based in New York City. He was a lumber merchant who worked closely with Fritz Kunst and Oliver Reiser on this project. And he was actually a major supporter of Chabad and helped it to grow in the United States in the post-war era. So anyway, some interesting research connections between Stulman and Foundation for Integrated Education and Chabad and sort of sacred energies here. But just sort of walking around, you can see this large outcropping. And my friend was saying they were thinking at some point it actually might have been a covering over like a cave system. So it's not clear at this point, unless you maybe have some sort of superpowers, how you would access any sort of cave. But it's quite an interesting rock. And what we were talking about before of rocks holding story, and thinking about the stories that are attached and the consciousness of the rock, right? And the rocks as our relatives, and the mining and the rocks. And I remember there was a children's book from back in the day, I think it was from the 70s maybe, or the 60s, about Sylvester and the magic pebble. And this sort of donkey child found this magical pebble and to make a wish, but he was confronted by something scary, and so that he asked to be turned into a rock, and then he was turned into a rock himself, and then this magic pebble fell off the rock, and then he couldn't make a wish to be turned back, and until one day he was actually restored to his donkey child self, but after much chagrin to his parents. And so we sort of think about rocks and consciousness and the beingness of these energetic presences that we share our relationships with, and the fact that other cosmologies, other cultures had far different relationships to stones than most of us do today. We don't really necessarily think of the stones as being alive, and yet for me, especially when I took that trip to Salt Lake City to see the Wasatch Range, knowing that this was part of it. So I'm up here on the rock. It's a little bit precarious, but you can see here. I'm going to go around and get to this is the monument here. To ensure the preservation of Spook Rock as a public monument, this plot of ground was donated to the Rockland County Society by David Carlo, July 23rd, 1931. And we just happened to look him up. And it was interesting to me that the Carlo family actually, they had apple orchards. And to think of the symbolism of apple both today, the Garden of Eden consuming the apple of knowledge, apple computers, apple as a toroidal shape of energy and such. So so up here on the rock, and then it's got some an embankment here to sort of hold it up from the intersection. We're just right here. And Spook Rock, my friend says, spook is actually Dutch, S-P-U-K-E, for spirit or soul. And you can see that we've put our intention down there with the heart and the marigolds and the leaves to sort of acknowledge this history, acknowledge this cosmology, its relevance in relationship to the Columbia University closed off Earth and Climate Science Center that wants to reduce these presences to core samples and data analytics and molecules, and just think think about the magic of the rock, right? Think about how magical the world could be if it were more animist and if we had more agency within that space. And that was something I guess that David Carlo recognized in 1931, was the preservation of these rocks that were considered sacred by the Lenape people. And so yeah, that's another story.